Hey, my name is Doug Holder, and I'm here with Poet to Poet, Writer to Writer. And every once in a while, I bring on a gifted poet from the Endicott College, Ibbetson Street Press Young Writer Series that was founded by Dan Sklar, Professor Dan Sklar, myself, some years ago, and now is directed by former student Emily Pineau, who is now a professional writer with good experience. Um, and just to give you a brief introduction to Aine, right? I got it
Anya.
right.
Yeah.
Aine Griffin is a junior at Endicott College, where she's studying English and secondary education. Griffin is from South Boston, Massachusetts, but a piece of her heart will always be with her family in Connemara, Ireland. When she is not writing, she loves painting, rowing, have long conversations with friends, and getting perpetually distracted. She has previously published in the Endicott Review and has received the Derby Medal for an English poem. Was the Derby Medal at Endicott or somewhere
No,
else?
it was at the end of high school.
At the end of high school. Where'd you go to high school?
Boston Latin School.
Oh,
And
great.
yeah.
So first tell us about, your experience at Endicott as an, you're like you're part English major and part secondary education. Maybe you could tell us a bit of how has it been a place to be a poet, and maybe some of the teachers that have influenced you.
Sure. Um, yeah, I think I would love to have done more with creative writing, but secondary education is kind of like there's a lot of classes you need to do for secondary ed, but I think one thing I've loved is bringing things from the creative writing classes I've gotten take to education, because I think sometimes that can be like a more rigid academic look at English, and I love opening it up to be more creative and applying those things to education. But I've taken Professor Sklar's creative writing classes, and one thing I love that he does in those is those like 15-minute free writes where you just don't stop your pen on the page. And I think some of the best ideas I've gotten come from moments like that. And the other thing I get definitely really inspired by is other people's writing. And I find sometimes even in my English classes that aren't about creative writing, I would be taking notes on something and then start a poem in the margin. Like there's a lot of allusions to really classical literary pieces.
Hold that book up. Well, I should have done that in the beginning. Hold that book up. Yeah, there you go. Very nice cover, beautiful cover.
Thank you.
Yeah, so how about any teachers? Well, you talked about Dan. Any other from our fine English department? Anyone that yeah, that
Yes.
you
Professor Watling is my advisor, and I've always felt very inspired by her classes, and she does more English classes than creative
Mhm.
writing. But and I've also Professor Reynolds, who wrote the review on the back of the book, does a lot with he's an ed professor, but he also has a creative writing background. And he has definitely inspired me to bring creativity to the classroom, definitely.
Obviously, right? Um, you write that your book is confessional, and how so? Did you read any of the confessional poets like Sexton and Plath or anything like that, or um,
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I chose the word confessional was because I felt that it was very raw and honest from myself, almost like a confession. And I feel like poetry I've written in the past has kind of I've buried stories in, you know, more grand language or fiction or other things. And this one I was just trying to kind of pluck honest truth. And that's kind of why I use the word confessional.
are there any poets that you model yourself after, or
Um, I'm not sure. I think there's a lot of influence from other poets, but I don't know if there's any I would necessarily model. But I really um, love I love Yeats and I love Whitman and I love a lot of the romantic poets, even though um, I think it is kind of a lot of them looking through the world through like rose tinted glasses, which is something I tried to acknowledge in this. But um, I think a lot of the more romantic poets I definitely resonate with.
good? Now, I was going to ask you. many of the one of the poems I particularly love is the first poem in the book, is South Boston, for South Boston, and there's such a wistful quality about that. A and it's almost like, I can picture that from a scene from Mystic River or Good Will Hunting or something, with the hats on back with the smoke and that symbolic cigarette, the smoke coming as we lose South Boston and it's probably lost to for the great deal of it is to gentrification.
Yeah,
You grew up in South Boston, right?
I did. And on my mom's side, we've been there for like 5 or 6 generations. So
Right.
ties to that on that side. Yeah.
But tell me about your experience in South Boston and the poem. How did that come about? What were you trying to get across?
Yeah. I think anyone who has grown up in South Boston, has had their parents grow up in South Boston, know that in the past 10 years, it's definitely seen a major, major shift. And I think there was this very defined identity of the neighborhood that is being lost to gentrification. And one thing I do want to point out, though, is the last line of the poem is for all its beauty and all its ugly, it's not going to breathe anymore. And because I think South Boston history and its past isn't necessarily purely positive, and the fact that it is disappearing isn't just a negative thing. There are parts of its identity that shouldn't be perpetuated into the future. But I
Like
think
Whitey Bulger, for instance.
right, and it definitely has a very racist past, and there's a
Right.
lot to it that is probably disappearing as well, and that's a good thing. But I think as it's a big piece of my identity in my home, as I know it is for a lot of people, and sort of that sense of community, that sense of neighborhood, the generational aspect of it. A lot of the kids I grew up with had also had families that had been there for generations, and just how the whole atmosphere of it is so different now. And I don't really know any of the kids I grew up with are gonna settle in South Boston like all our parents did, because it's so expensive. Like I think all the older generations, kind of like I was talking about with my grandmother, are kind of passing on, and the younger generations aren't able to stay. And I think even though there are negative parts of the city that are being lost, it's also important to grieve the fact that a legacy is also being ended.
Well stated. Um, I always say to my students in creative writing, you have to bleed, and you do this in your collection. You deal with some pretty intimate stuff. You make yourself vulnerable. And for and for instance, I was very taken by generations of strong woman,
Yeah.
and where you talk about your body image and how and the ancestral line and all that. Maybe you could talk a bit about how you bleed and how hard was it for you to quote unquote bleed in these poems and really make yourself vulnerable.
Sure. Yeah, so Generations of Strong Women, that's one that I also love, and it's kind of about how we shrink ourselves as women, or both both physically and also like with our opinions and keeping things to ourselves, and kind of how um I should be so proud of like my broad shoulders and my height, because it's been passed down from the other side of my family who lived in Ireland, who were doing so much physical labor and were such strong women, and how I get to this point and I'm like, why am I like this if this is the legacy I'm supposed to be carrying on? And I think what I'm trying to expose a lot in the book is kind of my own weakness, and I think a lot of people's weakness when it comes to that, because I think that's something we kind of stifled down a little bit, and we act like, we're strong and we're independent and we're this and we're that, but we still, I think, as a gender, have this sort of plague that of wanting to make ourselves smaller, wanting to make ourselves wanted for a million of different reasons that are explored through the book. But one thing that's tied into Generations of Strong Woman, and it's tied into a lot of the other pieces, is this sort of binary of like, you are not your body, like you are so much more expansive than your physical form, but also without your body, you don't exist. And it is very much connected to your identity and who you are. And then in the poem, like A Foreign Home, I I think I was trying to symbolize that sort of line in the binary with the horizon line of where like heaven meets earth, where our like spiritual expansive identity meets this very like real, tangible human existence. And we have to kind of find peace with walking in that line between the divine and the earthly. But yeah, in terms of like you were saying, like bleeding into the pieces, a lot of it was things, and this is also why I called it confessional, that I didn't feel comfortable writing about until this past year, or I didn't feel separated enough almost to write about it. And like the 3 short stories are things that are very, very personal to me, and feelings that are very personal to me, but also things I hope other people can relate to. And even though I sort of framed them in stories, there a lot of that is lines taken from journals and things like that.
Now, I know you wrote a poem in Celtic, and you're just back from Ireland, right?
Yes.
Now, how was that trip for you? That was through the Endicott's exchange student program, or what was that through?
Oh no, I went to Greece actually through Endicott semester, and I was in Athens for a few months, and then afterwards I went and spent Christmas with my family in Ireland.
Oh, okay. So, but it's still an how is that? I mean, how is Ireland for you? Going back to the, roots and connecting with that.
It is definitely one of my like favorite times of year when I get to go back there. And my dad has a massive family over there, and he's one of the only ones over here. So growing up, we went there like every summer, and I would spend a big difference from growing up in the city too. My family live in like rural Ireland, hundreds of sheep. Like it's the best time. And I definitely feel so much myself and so much connected to my identity when I'm back there. And kind of getting to experience that also with my dad, who, even though he didn't get to raise me there, like he was raised there, I feel like it's so much my home as well, because I went so often growing up.
And your Irish, your Irish heritage is obviously, throughout in the texture of all your writing.
Yeah, for sure. And my dad is a really great storyteller. And when I was a kid, he would tell me so many stories about him growing up in Ireland. And I think that definitely like sparked my own creativity about kind of where to go with those stories and storytelling. But even just from his own retelling of his childhood and fairy stories and Celtic myths and things like that, that I just was infiltrated with growing up, it's definitely affected my own writing and creativity.
If I was to ask you, why should people read this book, what would you say?
That is a great question.
Well, the New York Times does it in the book review, so I figured I'd ask you.
I would say if you fall, okay, I have a few answers. If you fall in sort of the category of a young adult who is kind of trying to reconnect with themselves, or you've felt very much like you don't, I'm trying to think of the way to phrase it, but a lot of this is my kind of self-discovery after kind of growing up this very like people-pleasing person and just trying to reconnect with who I really am. And I think if you're someone who's trying to feel at home once again in your own body and feel like you're trying to get that sense of self-actualization, this might be a good book. I also think it is a sort of unfiltered description of young femalehood, if that's something someone is interested in. And also it's very personal to me, and I try to be as honest as possible. And I think through sharing honest stories, we can help each other feel a little less alone, and being very vulnerable, we can help each other feel less alone when you read someone who's had an experience similar to yours. So yeah, that's my answer.
Great answer. So listen, I want you to read poems of your choice from your new collection, which actually I've seen has been a bestseller. I checked a lot of people, must be a lot of people in your family and friends are buying it.
So sweet.
Yeah. 3 pages of sales. What that big Irish family, right?
Yeah.
So a foreign home, and only one poem that I request that you read is the South Boston poem, because
Sure.
I find that really good. I mean, they're all good, but I mean, I like the South Boston poem.
Well, why don't I start with that one then and kick it off?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. For South Boston. When I think of the city I knew as a child, I think of my grandmother's back deck, tucked in between the triple deckers. It was just a few potted plants, a chemtrailed square of sky, and a slice of hot city air, but it gave me hard ground beneath my feet and breath pounding through my bones. For 10 years I sat out there, a sticky cherry slush smile permanently smeared across my face, counting down the glory days while planes whirred overhead and church bells sang in the distance. My Momo and her lovely satin voice telling me stories of the homeland, Johnny next door with his midday cigarettes and his wife beaters, jump ropes and scraped knees, front stoops in the Daily Herald, boys with backwards caps and mean streaks. That's all I knew of the city. That's all I knew of the world. When I turned 13, my grandmother's porch chair lay empty, a vacant throne amid the potted plants. All spring, I sat out there with the geraniums and Johnny, and together we grieved as her breath, her ration of cement and air, was released back to the city. In my naivety, I could only mourn the loss at the tip of my nose. I couldn't see my Momo's vacant deck was just one of hundreds, a single drop in the wave of change washing over the city. Last year, Johnny's building was sold for close to $1 million. He had one last cigarette standing in his back door. The ashes embered in the old white dish as he blew a final stream of smoke into the July air. I watched it dance up to the clouds, spiral in the gap between the buildings, and disappear. It was a quiet tribute, a lonely goodbye. I wonder if the man who bought the apartment, a young 30-something from Rhode Island who surfed and worked downtown, I wonder if he ever thought about the man who left the ashtray on his porch. I wonder if before investing in an urban property, he thought about whose backs he stood on, who owned that little square of cement and sky and air before him. Because I don't always think about it when people ask me where I'm from. I don't always think about the hundreds of back decks pressed between the apartments and the generations that called them home. And how one day, when the final front stoop, when the final slice of sky is sold, the air of the neighborhood will belong to new lungs, and the city I knew as a child, for all its beauty and all its ugly, will breathe no more.
Great poem.
Thank you.
It should be somewhere, installation art, somewhere installed somewhere in the city, something like that. Yeah, South Boston probably.
For South Boston, yeah. Maybe a painting of the back deck,
Right.
put it together to see.
Yeah.
Should I pick like a one or two?
Whatever
more?
you want. It's your ball game.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'll read the title poem, "A Foreign Home," because I think that encapsulates one of the feeling I was trying to get at in some of the short stories, because those are a bit long to read. But so this is "A Foreign Home."
Foreign home.
The waves almost swallowed me today, almost kept me forever in the cold September water of the bay. My body went numb looking out at the horizon as I became the space where the two blues meet. When they spit me back out, I went home to my old friend hanging on the wall and wondered why I recognized my reflection more in the trees and in the sea, in the stars and in the skyline, than framed in this square of glass, just a hard punch away from shattering. I seemed to know everyone in my life so well. The sound of their footfalls on the stairs, the smell of their pheromones and sweat and dirty laundry, the way they tap their lips before they speak, and the saunter of their hips, and the little idiosyncrasies that come out when they're agitated. But sometimes I can't quite believe my body goes about the world the same way theirs do. I do not pray that one day I align my physicality and my psyche. I pray that I find peace in knowing I never will. For I think when I stop looking for answers in breakable reflections, I'll be able to walk fearlessly between heaven and earth, content with balancing on the horizon line, knowing I am but the pulse of the universe incarnate, and the body will always be a foreign home.
Nice. You want to give us one more?
Sure. Maybe I'll do Imago Day, the last one I closed it off with.
Okay.
Yeah, so this was the first poem, the middle poem, and the end poem. So someone needs to buy it and read everything in between.
Right, you got to do that. Yeah.
But yeah, this is Imago Day, and this one also means a lot to me with
Right.
kind of go together. As I float between who I am and who I'm becoming, sometimes I can't help but get so dizzy, so groundless, that I have to stop midday just to swim in my uncertainty. Sitting with the world in my throat, I close my eyes and go back to that familiar scene, the little bench in the garden of roses and rectitude, where I can find my breath in the quiet pulse of creation. When they open, I acknowledge I'm not alone. By a tree in the garden stands the man. My heart jumps as I think of everything he is. The strong arm and the warm hand and the young grin, the tender piece of flesh above the groin, the bulging muscle of the thigh. When he walks over to the bench, my cheeks flush with swirls of heat, and I feel like I did when I was a young girl, sitting on the edge of the schoolyard, wide eyes and butterflies, watching the boy with the freckles and gap teeth. I've been waiting for you, I say, as he sits down on my right. He rests his head on my shoulder, and I think of everything I would give up just to hold him, in my heart and in my home and in between my teeth, forever. But then, more subtly, in walks the woman. She isn't as abrasive about it, glowing in my periphery, her body bathes in sinking hues of violet and blue. I call to her, "Mum, sister, friend, come join us in the shade." But tasting my insincerity, she just stands, wise and patient at the threshold. Frightened, I try to cling to the man, but the violet of the woman bleeds into my vision and covers the edges of my throat. I can't breathe. When I'm choking, gasping for air, I let myself see it. The soft meeting of her lips, the dip of her collarbone, the curving fat of her waist. There's a magic that dances around her and a fiery blaze behind her eyes that takes the wind from my lungs and shoots the pulse of new life through my veins. She frightens me, for I can love the man as an outsider. I can love every inch of him for everything I am not, but I know the woman too deeply. I know her pleasure and I know her plight. I know her beauty and admiration, and I know it in envy. But despite these fears, I also know when she sits on my other side, I feel miraculously myself, a hand in Adam's and a hand in Eve's. I am powerful and alive. Before I can run back in cowardice, they lean in and kiss the tender flesh of my neck, while I stare, steadfast and unbreaking, into the eyes of God, and ask him if he likes his reflection.
Wonderful. Great reflection.
Thank you.
And identity. To ask me, I was going to ask you, are you reading anywhere from, do you have a reading like scheduled in Southie, or do you have local libraries or anything like that? Or
No,
you're going
definitely, no.
Yeah, or because the local newspaper would definitely be interested in that. I always advise you to send their work into local newspapers, and also your poetry will be appearing in my column in the Somerville Times.
I'm
And
so excited about that. Thank you.
and I hope you'll be at the reading in April at the library at Endicott College.
Yes, I will for sure.
Yeah,
Be there.
that'd be great. And are you on the Endicott Review?
I am. Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
that's great. It's a great magazine. Well, I want to thank you for joining me on Poet to Poet, Writer to Writer, and you can purchase her book. It should be on Amazon soon. I don't know if it is yet, but it's definitely on lulu.com. Just put her name and the book's title, A Foreign Home. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.